Oh my. I don't know. You know, there's a, yeah, like the people when I've been once, honestly, because the issue is oh, so I'm like, it was fun when I went, but what do you guys do? Yeah, when we you know. On this, I'm just curious to say that oh, do you see? That's yeah,
Okay.
no idea what I'm taking. Yes, after you, yeah. Ready? Yeah. When I look at the hospital, this is interesting. Where I look at the
Alrighty. Ooh. Okay. Jump back in here. Okay. Let's keep going and get y'all out of here as soon as possible. Okay. So, obviously, here's where we ended off a minute ago. And so far, as I can tell, I've failed to be boring enough to get any of you to drop the class. So, I'm kidding. I was checking something else, not at all looking at that. All right. So, schools, right? Change the relationship of adults and children. Okay. So, according to Postman and what he kind of thinks is going on, once we separate people into these distinct age categories, right, and abilities according to age, you start to get the emergence of specific youth cultures. Now, this is just starting right kind of in, the 1500s, the 16th century, and by the 18th century, it's more formed. Where we'll really see this take its greatest shape is in the 20th century, when we get compulsory universal public education, and we put a bunch of kids in public school. Kids way outnumber adults. So we'll start to get things like really, really distinct youth cultures, especially say amongst the baby boomers, where you get things like the hippie generation and all of that stuff. But this is just sort of the start, right? Once you start putting young people together in a confined space, you start to get youth cultures, right? And Postman kind of notes, this is a quote from the book, when any group is formed on the basis of a characteristic, in this case, age, it's inevitable that you start to notice other characteristics. So, by the end of the 15th century, or the 1500s, the 16th century, you start to get more of a norm around children having distinct children's fashions, right? And especially amongst the middle and upper classes, you get parents basically treating their kids as items of, or objects of conspicuous consumption, right? They start to buy things specifically for their children. You start to get a differentiation, children's books with different language, right? Language that's directed specifically at children. Books on pediatrics, right? Pediatrics written prior to 1600, we're not exactly sure when, but doctors start to notice, okay, children are different from adults in major ways, and we have to treat them differently. And the first book for children, right, which is this one, The History of Jack the Giant Killer. It's the first children's book that we have record of, and we still have copies of it kicking around today. It's published in 1744, right? So language differentiation, children's books, it all comes from starting to think of children as different from adults, right? So you stop learning you stop at a certain point just teaching kids to read with adult books, like say the Bible, and you start teaching them to read with children's books, right? And the first one that we have a copy of is Jack the Giant Killer. Okay. So the other thing that starts to happen, and this is probably, you get this prior to, like in the 1700s, right? So we're talking about the 18th century, but in the 1700s, you start to move towards more of a notion of what you would call the modern nuclear family, right? Where you start to move away, and this increases with industrialization, but you get mom, dad, and their kids, right? As the nuclear family, right? So part of this, and again, this doesn't happen equally. You get this first emerging in the middle and upper class. I don't know what I did. You get this first emerging in the middle and upper classes, and then it's going to trickle down to the working class and the poor much later on. Excuse me. So ultimately, what this results from the long period of schooling, right? We need long periods of schooling, so it reshapes the kind of form of the family, right? We start to get, certain ideological kind of shifts, particularly like the one I was mentioning with Luther's Catechism, the idea that parents are the key educators of their children, and that mother and father have these particular kind of teaching roles for their kids. So parents become the key educators, and in places that are wealthy. So we're thinking here principally of England, because England gets there first. But we can say to some extent in the Netherlands and in Denmark as well. You start to get the middle class, separating away from extended family groups and using their increased wealth to buy larger segmented homes, right? So you go from that single room kind of house towards, more what we would think of as a house today, right? With a kitchen and a dining area and more kind of, children's bedrooms. And if you think of, I'll give you a weird example of this, but I think it works. If you think of the movie Peter Pan, right? Think of the classic Disney animated one, right? Despite all of its weird racial things. One of the things that's really interesting about it and about this particular story is that it starts in, the nursery. Right? So this middle class English home somewhere in the 19th century has a nursery, right? So a place where the children all sleep together in a single room. And what's the big conflict in the story? Well, it's that Wendy, she's transitioning from childhood to adulthood, and she's going to have to leave the nursery, and she'll have to be separated from her brothers because she's moving into adulthood, right? And there's a sort of cultural, I don't want to say cultural trauma, but definitely a cultural moment associated with the film Peter Pan, right? So you go from the one-room house to a house with at least a parent's room and a nursery and some other kinds of spaces. Other things you might kind of start to see, well, is things like smoking rooms. Can't write. For some reason, I can never write on the bottom of the screen. Smoking rooms or studies or these kinds of things, especially amongst the wealthy and middle class, right? And if you've ever watched the show Downton Abbey, right, you know that after dinner, the men go off to the smoking room to drink whiskey and smoke cigars and talk about politics, all those things that aren't appropriate for the children or the women, right? So you start to get these distinctions between public knowledge and private space, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide as well. Yeah, children, become objects of conspicuous consumption for the middle class and upper classes that can afford it. You buy special toys, special books, special clothing for your children, and you start to consume products, right? Buy products from the burgeoning industrial economy for your children, which, it starts to produce these things as well. Now, that said, it's going to take a long time for this to trickle down to the lower classes. And so you get things like, if we want to talk other literary references, Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, right? Which takes place in the 19th century, right? The 1800s. And you see, a lot of working class kids forced still into labor, right? There are chimney sweeps and there are kids working in factories and mines and all of these kind of horrors of the early industrial period. They don't get, their own rooms or special clothing or conspicuous consumption from their parents because they come from different classes altogether. Okay. So what's most important for Postman, though, is that, adults, once you get into teaching, once you get kids into school, and this will become more important as we go forward, right, through the 19th century and industrialization into the 20th century with compulsory schooling up to the age of 16, you basically have adults controlling the symbolic environment of young people more and more, right? And the transition from childhood to adulthood is one that's measured out, again, not equally socially, starts in the middle classes, but you start to kind of slowly roll out knowledge, information to young people as you think they're ready for it. So the transition from childhood to adulthood becomes one that's deeply controlled by the adults, right? Children evolve, and I use that word consciously, towards adulthood by becoming readers, right? By consuming a particular type of media. And what does that build? So according to Postman, and this is a very, this comes from a very particular school of media studies. You might he calls it media ecology, but if you think of what's his name? The Toronto guy, Marshall McLuhan, right? Has this aphorism, the medium is the message. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but that print sort of changes the way people think, right? So it does a couple of things. According to Postman, it builds individuality. Why? Well, because you consume print individually, right? You and the book are kind of in a one-to-one relationship, right? You learn to read, and it kind of cuts you off from the rest of the world. Again, if you're a Disney fan, think of Beauty and the Beast, right? And the beginning of Beauty and the Beast, Belle is walking around with her head in a book, right? With her face in a book, and she's barely aware of what's going on around her, right? So she's in that individual relationship with the written word, right? So it builds individuality, and that experience you have within the book is just yours. It's not a communal one. Logical and sequential thinking, right? Grammar and learning the rules of grammar sort of require a sort of logical and sequential thinking. High order abstraction, right? Suddenly books can take you away from the here and now, right? I hate to use Harry Potter as an example, but even though none of those things exist, you can be transported away by a Harry Potter novel to Hogwarts, a world where there's wizards and witches and Voldemorts and Snapes and all of these sorts of things, and Dumbledore. All of these things, right? This is an abstraction, right? You can imagine things that aren't actually there. You can imagine a machine, right, designed by someone else if you see the schematics of it and explained to you in print. So it creates a level of abstraction that's ordered outside of your everyday experience. And for Postman, and I don't know how true this is, but he certainly thinks so, print requires delayed gratification, right? Because you have to sit there and you have to sort of experience the thing. You have to put your life on hold to read the book. If you're going to read a mystery novel or you're going to read Harry Potter and you're going to get to the ending where Harry kills Voldemort, you have to take the time. So you have to delay your gratification as you work through the text, right? And so, very importantly though, learning becomes an intellectual and a moral pursuit. Teaching young people how to read becomes something that's coached in terms of morality, and the cardinal sin starts to become, and this is especially true in the Enlightenment, one of the worst things that you can be is ignorant, right? Because ignorance is the opposite of having learned, and you learn through reading. Okay. Oh yeah, I just made that. It's extremely hot. That was poor planning on my part. All right, I should have taken the one I've been cooling for hours. Oh, one day I'll learn. My tumbler is too good. I'm going to open the lid so it can be cool. All right. So, I have way too much liquid here. This is going to be bad. All right. The class will be over when I really, really have to go pee. Okay, so, kind of like what I was saying a slide or two ago, you get a distinction with print and with growing wealth, these segmented houses, between public and private spheres, right? And particularly, it's gendered to begin with, in the kind of 18th and 19th centuries, they have strongly gendered kind of spheres, but you start to get a distinction between what you do in public and what's public knowledge and what happens in the privacy of the home. So you start to build a notion of individual privacy, individual freedoms, and individual distinction in that way. So you get things like public knowledge, things that are okay to be discussed anywhere. And especially, right, this is often phrased in terms of what can you talk about in front of women and children, right? Because these are seen as somehow more delicate than men. So public knowledge is what's okay to talk about in the everyday. And famously, it excludes things like sex, war, politics, religion, economics in lots of cases. So, and then private knowledge, what needs to be kept secret from some, right? So why do the men in Downton Abbey go off to the smoking room to talk about the politics of the day? Well, they go to the smoking room because that knowledge is supposed to be kept secret from the children and the women, right? It is supposed to be, it's somehow not appropriate for them. It is a sort of private knowledge. So, only when you're deemed adult enough are you let in on certain things, right? So you're not as opposed to the Middle Ages where there was no real need to teach people about sex because everybody just sort of knew, it becomes something that there has to be a process for learning about sex, right? The awkward sex ed class you had in elementary and junior high fundamentally comes from the fact that, at least in theory, we keep that knowledge from people until we think they're ready for it. And Postman thinks, it's in this period that shame really returns in European society as an important category. When you start to get private ideas, public ideas, private space, right? Certain things go on in the bedroom that the children aren't supposed to know about. And all of this is kind of, under the supervision of teachers and parents. Now, as time goes on, much more of it shifts into the realm of teachers, right? Where, things like today we think of sex ed as something principally that teachers are going to end up doing rather than parents, but that is not neither here nor there at this point. Okay, so industrialization, right? So prior to industrialization, we start really industrialization in England in major ways, roughly the middle part of the 18th century, about 1750. And this is where you get that really, really strong split between the classes, right? Because the wealth of this class, shoots up. The merchant class in England, had already been doing well prior to the Industrial Revolution, and some of this had been happening, but it just goes completely, I don't want to say bonkers, but the disparity between the kind of upper and middle classes and the working class and the poor, I don't want to say these guys go down, but they just kind of stay where they always were, right? So you get a real distinction. So you get a huge blossoming of childhood for the young of the upper and middle classes. And, the children of the poor and working class, continue to get continue to work. They're still in factories. They're chimney sweeps. They're all of these things that you see, in Charles Dickens's novels from the 18th century. Oh, and it's all, a kind of strange thing happens. I don't want to get ahead of myself because I can't remember what's on this slide. Okay, I'll jump. I'll say this. Sorry, I forgot what was on my slides because I've taught this so many times now I don't remember. Okay, so what ends up happening, right, is eventually what happens is these folks, the upper and middle classes, they have their kids, right? And they think of their children as these lovely creatures. They're so innocent, and you start to get this narrative. The childhood is a time of innocence and a time of joy and a time of play. And it takes a while, right? It'll take until, the middle part of the 19th century and then into the kind of end of the 19th century and 20th century. But people start to think of the children, people here, right, in the upper and middle classes, look at the people here and they see children, right? They have their own children. They start to see the children of the working class and the poor as children themselves. And so they start to think, well, we need to start treating these children the same way we treat ours. Now, this will end up taking on some really weird classist and even at times racist sort of orientations because, in the 19th century, you get what's called, in the upper and middle classes, and you can see this in England, you see this in America, and you see this in Canada, what ends up being called the child saving movement. So it's a sort of reaction to, seeing the children of the working and lower classes and the, poor suffering, right? They often don't have enough to eat. They're having to work. Their parents have orphaned them, right, or abandoned them, or they've been orphaned. So they have no kind of means to support themselves. They start committing crimes. They get into all sorts of trouble. And so the upper and middle classes sort of think, okay, we have to save these children. And often, it's blamed on their parents being of inferior kind of moral stock. There's a lot of discourses around Irish and Italians, being poor parents. Why? Because they're Catholic. And, all the people here tend to be Anglicans or Protestants of some kind. But you start to get this notion that young people need to be cared for in some way, right? And that it's the responsibility of the society to take care of them and somehow get the children that are down here up here. And this is where you get, in the 19th century, child labor laws starting, right? They're like, we can't have young people working in factories, so we have to pass laws banning child labor. The kind of beginnings of the social welfare system. And this will become really important when we get to the unit on crime, because the whole kind of youth criminal justice system emerges, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century from this kind of movement. But it's them noticing that these children of the poor and working class are just like their children, except they don't have all of the advantages. Okay, excuse me. So, Postman brings up a couple of interesting ideas that emerge sort of at different times, but ultimately have come to sort of govern how we think about children. So this one, you've probably heard this phrase before, right? The blank slate, right? So that when kids are born, they're a blank slate. The Latin phrase is tabula rasa, right? Which literally just means blank slate. This is the idea that comes, and this is from John Locke. And Locke sort of looks at children as like, okay, when children come into the world, they're sort of unformed, right? They're like a piece of paper that no one's written on, or a chalkboard that no one has written anything on. They are completely blank. So, what goes wrong? How do you end up with bad kids? Well, you have bad parents and teachers that write bad things on that blank slate. So, what do you need to do? Like, what's the moral imperative in this kind of system? Well, because the mind is blank, right, you have to write good things on it. And so this ultimately kind of leads into a shift into expert classes in some ways, right? You need experts that are trained in writing good things on these blank slates. So the professionalization of, say, the teacher kind of comes from this idea, right? We need to write good things on the blank slate of young people's minds, and we need people trained to do that. So we train teachers, we create teachers' colleges specifically for that. And generally, again, something went dark and I panicked. Generally this is the sort of elite class imposing their values on everybody else. So Locke also has this idea that children don't just need to be trained mentally, but also physically. So for those of you who are traumatized by junior high and high school gym class, you can thank John Locke for that, because fundamentally it's kind of his idea. It's like, oh, we need to make sure that kids are physically trained as well as mentally trained, so we'll have them do gym class. And you can also probably thank John Locke for grades. Because it's not just about, learning something, but we need to evaluate what people know, and we need to shame those who are doing bad and credit those who are doing good. So we create things like grades and ways of marking things. And, if you were the one traumatized because you didn't get the star sticker that said good job in first grade, ultimately you can blame John Locke for that as well. So if you're still holding that against that kid that always got the star, John Locke is actually the one to blame. Now, I mean, this kind of idea plays out in really weird ways, right? It has a long history, but one of the other places that you can kind of find it is in residential schools. So, when the Canadian government, as part of the Indian Act of 1876, is thinking of, how are they going to integrate Indigenous people into Canadian society? Obviously they have a notion, formed in the culture of their time, that European culture and Christian culture is superior to Indigenous cultures. And so they're like, all right, what we have to do, and sort of impetus behind residential schools, is we need to be the ones to get to the blank slate first, right? So we're going to write good, English. I was going to draw a Union Jack, but probably take too long. Good English and Christian things on that blank slate before their Indigenous parents have a chance to write all of those, Indigenous things on the blank slate. So all of this, it has these kinds of good and bad sides. It creates fundamentally the Western way of thinking about young people in some ways, but also it's like, okay, well, if we get there first and we put them in schools that we control, teaching them things that we control, we can, essentially wipes out Indigenous cultures. So it kind of comes from that place too. Okay. Rousseau. Rousseau. All right. So one of the other kind of ideas that Postman flags as being really central to young people and how we think about young people come from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And there could scarcely be a more ironic person to base your ideas of childhood on than Rousseau, because while he had very distinct... Is that my microphone buzzing? I'm just going to mute that for a sec. I don't know what's buzzing.
It happened.
Weird. All right. It was the main program audio. Okay. Oh, that's so annoying, that low-level buzzing. All right, much better. Okay. Rousseau, a really weird kind of character in the history of Western thought. Notable for the fact that he wrote a lot about children, but, fathered numerous children and abandoned all of them. So, his account of childhood as this wonderful time that we need to protect is strangely at odds with, the fact that he treated them terribly. I mean, this is like roughly akin to noting that Marx, a proponent of the working class, seemed to hate them with a special kind of hatred, and often mistreated, say, his maid in particular ways, and may have sexually assaulted a number of his housekeepers. So, for the guy who was like, proletariat of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. By the way, I'm the one chaining you. Marx was a special character. Rousseau, kind of like Marx, had some interesting ideas. We never managed to quite live up to them. Okay, some of the ideas from Rousseau, that children are a good in and of themselves, right? So they're not the means to some sort of end, right? That children weren't, in the Lockean sense, something that we shape for the good of society. No, that children are good in and of themselves, and they should be treated as such. And one of the things that, and I think we still see this in discourses today, and especially, how much we hold up youth and youthful energy and youth protest as being somehow, okay, I'll put it this way, because I don't know how else to put it. This is an idea, right? That, children, their emotional psychological needs approach the state of nature, right? That they are the closest to what humans actually are, and there's something special and unique that has to be upheld about that, right? They have this energy, this dynamism, this strength, this joy, and sometimes, shall we say, a sort of special wisdom that only the young have. And where do we see this in kind of contemporary society? Because this idea is still definitely around. How dare I? Right? So Greta, how dare you use me as an example? You've stolen my childhood. All right. I've stolen her childhood to use as an example, right? So Greta Thunberg, right, the environmental activist, I think she's now like almost 20, so barely counts. But when she was like 16, right, she had her protests, and she was held up by, world leaders as this, young person whose voice we really, really should listen to. Why? Because she had that strength, that dynamism, that passion of youth, right, and a sort of special wisdom, right? Because she was closer to that sort of state of nature because she's still a child, right? Now she's gotten older, people pay less attention to her because she's not as useful in that way. Okay, now interestingly, and I think really important, instead of writing on the blank slate, one of the things that Rousseau really stresses is that children need to be lovingly cultivated, and that education is there to make whatever they're already good at grow, right? So education becomes less about shaping them towards an end that society needs. Like, do we need good workers? Well, no. What we should be doing is shaping people so that their inclinations ultimately, and the things that they're good at, the things that they're interested in, emerge, right? So if they're a great artist, we should, or they're good at drawing, we should shape that so they become a great artist. In my case, the reason I spend $1,000 or more a year on horseback riding lessons is because I'm lovingly cultivating my daughter's love of horses. I wish she loved something cheaper. Sorry. Oh, horses. I haven't yet purchased a horse, but my daughter is pushing me. She's like, well, that girl got a horse for her birthday. I'm like, yeah, that girl's parents are millionaires. So I'm just a poor, corrupt professor. All right. All right. Oh, Freud. Is this because you heard my rant about Freud and sociology of religion? Okay. I hate Freud passionately. Herr Sigmund. All right. So Freud, I won't go on quite the rant. If you want to hear my rant about how stupid I think Freud is, you have to take sociology of religion with me, wherein I lament the fact that his account of how religion emerges is pure fiction. But like most of what Freud says, Freud, I think, still has a bunch of things that he contributes to ideas of childhood, rather sadly. Okay, so Freud, amongst others, talks about the fact that children have an emergent sexuality, right? And we'll never, I think, quite get away from Freud. And that there's this kind of duality in human beings, right? There's these instincts and drives, and that the whole goal and the whole way that we emerge as adults is ultimately to crush those drives, to form them, to sublimate them. And once you've sublimated them, you can truly be called an adult. Now, the other thing, obviously, that Freud talks about is that this leaves a whole bunch of trauma on people, right? That basically the sublimation of our desires and our kind of natural instincts leaves us often wanting to go back to those things, and that, the process of creating adults in a kind of industrial society or in a civilized society is about kind of crushing the natural part of human beings and forcing them into this industrial mold, right? Not for nothing, the book that this comes out as is called Civilization and Its Discontents, right? That basically, the adult is sort of the crushed child and the de-instinctivized child. Now, I think, again, Freud comes with all sorts of problems, and has all sorts of fictions, like the idea that all boys want to murder their fathers and sleep with their mothers, which is the Oedipus complex, and all girls want to kill their mothers and sleep with their fathers, the Electra complex, which he takes from classical antiquity. And, I don't know. I feel like Jordan Peterson could make the same case, but we won't go into it. All right, and now we'll talk about the last one, because I actually think Dewey, in lots of ways, is probably the most interesting. And along with Locke, I think one of the ones whose influence remains in major ways. Dewey, you talk about him a lot. If you take an education degree, you talk about Dewey's ideas a lot. But again, like Rousseau, he sort of stresses that, children have to be treated as a good in and of themselves, not the means to an end, right? So away from that Lockean idea that the goal of children is to become adults, right? So we shape them into adults. That actually they just their needs need to be addressed in the present, right? The children are a special kind of category, and you need to figure out what they need at a particular moment, rather than thinking, how do I get, I don't know, let's say little Timmy. How do we get from here to Big Timmy, right? Dewey is like, okay, but what does little Timmy need? And this is, I think, kind of still the basis of kind of contemporary educational theory. It's like, how do we, what are the needs of these particular people at their specific ages, and how do we, address those needs so that when we get to, Big Timmy, he's smiling. Sorry, my drawing is terrible. I love doodling on my slides, but I'm probably bad at it, right? So we want, people to be well adjusted, happy individuals when they get to adulthood. Okay. All right, so a couple more slides here, and then we'll just start talking about generations a little bit. But I do want to end off, just talking about what kind of happens at the end of the 19th century and in the 19th century. So Postman, I think, does a good job of covering, basically what happens from about 1440 till, 1800 or the middle part of the 19th century, 1850. And it's this slow kind of evolution and discovery that children are a thing, right? And it goes from, it takes 400 years, 4 centuries to really go to something that roughly kind of has a modern idea of childhood. By the time we get to the early 20th century, the idea of childhood is relatively recognizable. And it's basically, right, this idea that children are innocent, right? There's an innocence. And that this is a time that needs to be protected by adults, right? It's a time where they're, and I guess childhood is a time of emergence. I can spell, I swear. Emergence, right? It's a time of innocence and emergence where we're cultivating, developing, and sort of shaping young people into the adults that they'll ultimately be, right? And the big shift from the Middle Ages where it was just, you're 4 or you're 6, and it's like, okay, go pick some eggs, go milk the cow, go learn how to cobble a cobbled thing. I know, it's a boot. But it's funny to say cobble a cobbled thing, right? Or blacksmith a blacksmith thing, where you're in the economy right away. And increasingly, by the time we hit the 19th century, the idea is we actually need to keep young people out of the economy. We need to allow them to form and develop more naturally and towards a kind of slow emergence into adulthood, right? And again, we start to get more and more, as we, learn more about children, as they're separated, as more of them go to school, as, they're shaped, we start to see differences. And one of the big ones is the discovery of adolescence, right? So again, this is kind of weird to think about, right? Because we don't have a term really for adolescence in English until somewhere around, the later part of the 19th century. So we're talking not even 200 years ago, right? But we discover adolescence as a distinct phase of kind of human development somewhere towards the end of the 19th century. And again, it's because we just start to think about it differently, right? It's not that people didn't go through puberty before. They did, but it wasn't, and there were, rituals that happened somewhere around like 12, 13, where suddenly you kind of became a man. But in terms of, oh, my daughter's 14. Keep calm and survive puberty. I resonate with this. Okay. So, she's very grumpy yesterday because she didn't get to sleep for 12 hours. Like, I need sleep, Dad. I'm like, okay, sure, but I also need you to do your homework before 3 a.m. So, victory for one of us. All right, so what happens, right? So we discover adolescence, right? And, pediatricians, doctors start talking, okay, there's this distinct phase we're going to call adolescence that happens, somewhere between like 12 and ends somewhere around 16, 17, depending on the sex of the person. So, we sort of discover it and start talking about it towards the end of the 19th century. And then, what happens is we start to try and control it, right? So towards the end of the 19th century, and again, especially in England, because England's weird, middle-class boys, start to be subject to strict disciplines, especially around sexuality, right? In the Victorian era, so end of the 19th century when Queen Victoria is the queen, there's this huge focus on sex. And so, you do a bunch of really weird things. Middle-class boys, for instance, are sent off to boarding schools. And especially in remote places in England. And one of the reasons for this, is we need to keep them away from girls, right? As they're going through puberty, so that we don't somehow misshape their view of the opposite sex. And we can tame their sort of predatory sexual instincts. So, excuse me, sorry, I'm really coughing a lot. I apologize. They're subject to strict discipline, especially around sexuality, sent off to boarding schools, and managing sex, especially during this period of puberty, becomes a major social concern. And one that we still live with, right? One that, we're still deeply concerned about in ways that, again, the medievals would have found genuinely incomprehensible. Okay, and what happens, the 19th century, as I was saying, you get the child-saving movement in response to a bunch of social changes. So as you get into industrialization, it creates a whole underclass of people who are really poor. And what's typically happening is a couple of things. Either, children are being abandoned by their parents who can't support them because they've moved into these industrial cities. There's no birth control, so they're having children. They can't support them, so they abandon them, and these kids are left to kind of fend for themselves. You get the massive growth of orphanages and these sorts of institutions to try and deal with this massive social problem. Or parents are, just busy. Mom and dad are both working. Dad is probably working off in a factory, and mom is at home, both taking care of younger children and probably working as well, right? So they have this weird system that's called the putting out system, where basically, the shirts, all the cloth is cut in the factory and then sent to some poor woman's apartment where, between making meals, breastfeeding, having children, taking care of children, she also sews some, a blouse or a shirt or something, and then sends it back to the factory and gets paid for each shirt that she completes. So everybody's working. We won't get the idea of the stay-at-home mom until really the 1930s when worker wages rise to the point where only one parent can work, and that's enough to sustain the family. And then kids at a certain age are just cut loose, right? It's like, go play in the street with your friends. And you can imagine kind of how well that works. Kids start to get in trouble. They commit crimes. They steal things. Young people start to have sex. Girls turn to prostitution to help out their families and support them. And the whole thing goes kind of awry. So that by the time you reach the kind of middle part of the 19th century, it becomes a major social problem. And the society sort of starts to band around, what are we going to do with young people? And what comes out of this is the beginnings of a social welfare system, right? You get, child protective services, and its precursors sort of emerge here. Public schooling as a solution, right? Well, what do we do with all these kids that are in the streets because their parents are working or orphaned? Well, we put them in public schools where they will at least learn, the basic skills to be an industrial worker later. And then the youth criminal justice system. When kids have gone too far off the reservation, when kids have gone too far off into kind of criminality, what do we do with them? Well, we're going to put them into a justice system that's aim is to rehabilitate them. We'll talk about this when we get to crime, but what this looks like is things like industrial schools and a probation system that allows judges to put people in school for a long time. Okay. Is that my... Okay. It's my last slide there. All right. So. Ow, that hurt. All right. So I will jump in to one other thing here. We'll do this for a couple minutes, and then I can't let you go a half hour early. Or could I? No, I refuse. We'll start talking about generations a little bit, and then we'll pick it up next time. And right, I have to restore my screen because it hates me. And my battery's about to die. How long do I have? Tell me. 23%. That's plenty. Okay, sorry. You're like, please die. No. All right. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit into the middle part of the 20th century. And we're going to look specifically at an account of kind of the different generations coming from Jean Twenge. So we're gonna skip ahead to basically look at kind of the youth experiences of a bunch of different generations, starting with the silence. Okay, so this book. So most of the information here is going to be taken from this book, which is Generations by Jean Twenge. So Jean is a psychologist. I guess she's a social psychologist. She's based at San Diego State University. From her early career, she's been a generational researcher, started working on questions about Gen X, and then wrote a couple of very unflattering books about millennials called The Narcissism Epidemic. Ouch, yeah, it hurts. About millennials and how we're all narcissists, followed by Generation Me, which is, basically accusing millennials of being just ever so self-focused. And then her most recent one before this was called iGen, where she wrote about sort of the internet's effect on Gen Z, who she wanted to call iGen, but it didn't really take. Okay, so Jean has a really interesting theory, and it's a really good book. Came out in March of 2023, so it's pretty current. And she argues for what she calls the technology model of generations, right? And really kind of starting with, so what's clear is that, prior to the silent generation, technological changes happened rather slowly, right? And we think of what we just talked about, with the printing press, how it affected kind of our idea of childhood and youth. It took a really long time. Once we get into the 20th century, however, technological change starts to move a lot more quickly, right? And especially after the Second World War, we get just a rapid kind of pace of kind of generational change. And so what she argues is that basically each generation is more or less defined by the technological conditions they experienced in their formative years, kind of between 12 and the end of their 20s, right? And that technological kind of environment shapes them through their whole lives. And it affects a whole bunch of things, right? Family, education, work, leisure, religion, politics, and mental health in significant ways. So the technological environment, you might call her a bit of a technological determinist, is going to shape the whole experience of young people. And she will suggest that new technologies create what she calls, or what we call, generation gaps and conflicts, where, young people will feel that their parents simply don't understand them because they're experiencing this whole new technological kind of world, right? That their parents are going to struggle to understand because they were shaped in a different technological era. So, the fact that my wife has a really, really hard time understanding what my son is doing when he's playing Fortnite with his friends, right? And they're chatting and talking and they're, cutting each other down and saying how terrible each other. I play Fortnite with my son and his friends and they think it's hilarious because they're like, dude, your dad plays Fortnite? I'm like, yeah, I suck at it, but I do play. Although I made it to Diamond before he did. So I'm going to hold that. But I did it with a very particular strategy of hiding really, really well. I discovered Bush Camp Dad on YouTube, and I'm like, I like this. Hiding. That's how I'm going to play from now on. So anyway, I'm really good at this game. By which I mean I'm good at hiding in bushes and other buildings. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So the fact my wife is just absolutely bamboozled by what these technologies are, and that my son and his friends, get home from school and immediately jump on Fortnite and spend time with each other. She literally just doesn't understand. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I kind of get it, but whatever. I'm trying to avoid the generation gap. At some point, I'm going to fall behind. All right. So the other thing that she'll suggest is that because of the accelerating pace of technological change, our generational cohorts are getting shorter and shorter. And you'll kind of see the dates as we go along. The periods get relatively short. The period for millennials and then for Gen Z, these periods are going to get shorter and shorter as we hit more and more technological change. Okay, so basically the other thing that she relies upon is what she calls life history theory. And basically she suggests that, historically parents have two kinds of choices in terms of, how many children they have and how they raise those children and how many resources they put into kids. And these are called the fast life strategy and the slow life strategy. Now, what she thinks is that as time has gone on and as we've moved through from industrialization to the present, we move more and more towards this, right? What's called, I can't write anymore. I don't know what happened. My pen died. All right. It probably needs to be charged. All right. What will I do? Oh, sad. We move more towards the slow life strategy, right? Basically, okay, so what is a fast life strategy? I'll take my broken one and see if it works. Or my computer is just, it's probably because the battery's low. It's decided it hates touchscreen now. Okay, so parents essentially have two choices, right? Either you can have a lot of kids, right? And you basically expect them to grow up very quickly so that they are able to take care of themselves in relatively short order, right? So probably by late childhood, early adolescence, they're able to, fend for themselves more or less. Okay. Fast life strategy, really common in societies where there's a high risk of mortality for both adults and children. So if you kind of expect that your, life expectancy is going to be somewhere in the 30s or 40s, chances are you're going to do a couple of things. You're going to start having children early, and you're going to kind of raise those kids to be as self-sufficient as possible, as quickly as possible. And you just have as many kids as you can, and just hope some of them make it, right? And that's basically the fast life strategy in a nutshell. Okay, the slow life strategy, so in these societies, right, more children earlier, more likely to be self-sufficient when one or both parents die. Infant mortality, in 1800 was 1 in 6. So 1 in 6 babies born died before their first birthday. And you can see the change by 2020, it's less than 1 in 200. So a giant change. So through most of history, the fast life strategy is the way people went, right? Because, women especially died. So mothers died in childbirth at astonishing rates. Children died of, disease in infancy and early childhood at fairly shocking rates as well. So you had more children basically to hope that some of them would survive and make it, right? Okay, as we move forward in time, as life gets a little bit more complicated, and specifically as mortality drops, we end up in what's called a slow life strategy. So less adult and infant mortality, and typically a slow life strategy is also marked by more complex economic circumstances. So education takes longer. So parents have fewer children and nurture them more. Why? Because in order to get them to the point of adulthood where they're self-sufficient, it's actually going to require a ton of resources. So think about today, right? And all of you are in university. I'm sure some of you have parents that are helping you out pay for university. This is why we have, in some senses, a slow life strategy now, because your parents are having to invest, in you for probably 20 odd years or more, right? Oh, my daughter told me she's not moving out till she's 25, and I'm like, great, super. I'll be paying for horseback riding lessons till I die. That'll be awesome. No, I love my daughter. I'm teasing a little bit. All right, so a bigger risk than, say, dying in childhood is actually falling behind economically, right? And not having, the resources or the access to become economically successful and, fully independent. So think about, the discourses that are going on now, right? Where we're talking about Gen Z, especially in Canada, because we're run by the right and honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and we'll soon be run by someone else who will be equally as incompetent. I told you I hate everyone. But we're in a situation now where we're talking about Gen Z will never be able to own a home, right? And that economically trying to get ahead, right, get that education, get that job in that field that's going to allow you access to that middle class, prosperous life is becoming more and more difficult. So your parents are having to invest more and more time and energy into, cultivating you, right? I don't know, putting you into like programming classes when you're, or what coding when you're in elementary school, sending you to coding camp or science camp and all of these things, hoping that some are, making you take music lessons. God, my music lessons were a waste of time when I was a kid. 6 years of piano lessons, and I was terrible. Oh, my parents wasted their cultivation. They should have cultivated something else. But, we cultivate our kids extensively, hoping, that they don't fall behind economically, right? That they're able to succeed and thrive. But it requires a lot of parental input. And this is, less so kind of risk of mortality. It's when we see a competition for seemingly scarce resources, right? So this leads to much fewer children, much more better grammar. Many fewer children, right? So people will have fewer children and put more parental resources in hopes that those children will succeed. And that very much seems to be where we are today, right? A slow life strategy. It's not just us, it's been building since, the middle part of the 20th century. All right, we'll do a couple more. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the silence, and then we'll cut out a few minutes early here. All right. Or do you want to start with the silence next time? I can go either way. Nodding. All right, let's stop. We'll pick up with the silence on Wednesday. We'll leave it here. I will let you go 12 minutes early. We'll call it our second break. So go get a coffee and don't come back. And we'll see you on Wednesday. And we'll pick it up and we'll talk about all these generations, because this seems like a good place to stop. All righty.